Margaret Thompson wiped her hands on her old apron and looked out the kitchen window. The morning sun was already hot, and she could see the broken fence posts in the distance. They had been broken for 2 months now, ever since the storm in May. Her husband Tom would have fixed them the next day. But Tom was gone. She walked to the front porch and sat down in the old wooden chair. The paint was peeling, and one of the arms was loose. Everything on the ranch needed fixing. The barn door hung crooked. The water pump made strange noises. The fence around the chicken house had holes that let the chickens run everywhere. Margaret was 42 years old, but she felt much older. 6 months ago, she had been a rancher's wife. Now she was a widow trying to run a 200-acre ranch by herself. She did not know how much longer she could keep going. The cattle needed to be moved to fresh grass. The hay needed to be cut before it got too dry. The horses needed new shoes. There were so many things that needed to be done, and Margaret did not know how to do most of them. Tom had always taken care of the heavy work. She had helped with the cooking, the chickens, and the garden. But the big ranch work was something she had never learned. Margaret heard a sound in the distance. She looked up and saw dust rising from the dirt road that led to her ranch. Someone was coming. She did not get many visitors these days. Most people from town felt sorry for her, but they did not know what to say. Her few friends had stopped coming by as much. They had their own families and their own problems. The dust cloud got bigger. Margaret could see it was a truck, an old pickup truck that had seen better days. The truck was pulling a small trailer behind it. Margaret stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. She was curious but also a little worried. She lived alone now, and strange visitors could mean trouble. The truck slowed down as it got close to her house. It was blue once, but now it was more gray than blue. There were dents in the side and rust around the wheel wells. The trailer behind it was small and looked like it carried everything someone owned. The truck stopped near her front gate. The engine turned off, and Margaret heard the door creak open. A man got out of the truck. He was tall and thin, with dark hair under a worn cowboy hat. His clothes were clean but old. His boots had seen many miles. He looked like a real cowboy, the kind that worked with cattle and horses every day. The man walked around to the other side of the truck. Margaret heard the passenger door open, but she could not see who else was in the truck because the man was in the way. Then she saw a small figure step out from behind the man. It was a little girl with long brown hair and 2 braids. She looked to be about 8 years old. The man and the little girl walked toward Margaret's gate. The man took off his hat and held it in his hands. This was the polite thing to do when meeting a lady. Margaret's father had taught her that a real gentleman always took off his hat when talking to a woman. "Ma'am," the man said in a deep, quiet voice, "I'm Jake Morrison. I was told you needed a rancher." Margaret looked at the man more carefully. His face was tan from working in the sun. He had lines around his eyes from squinting in bright light. His hands were rough and strong. These were the hands of a man who worked hard for a living. Behind Jake, the little girl stayed close to his legs. She held a small stuffed horse in her arms. The horse was brown and white, and it looked like it had been loved for a long time. One of its ears was a little flat, and its mane was tangled. The little girl looked up at Margaret with big brown eyes, then quickly looked down at the ground. "Who told you I needed help?" Margaret asked. She was surprised. She had not told anyone. She was looking for help. She could not afford to pay anyone, so she had not even thought about asking. "Pete Williams," Jake said. "I met him at the livestock auction in Millerville last week. He said you might need someone to help with your ranch. He said your husband passed away and you were trying to run the place alone." Margaret knew Pete Williams. He was an old rancher who lived about 10 miles away. Pete had been friends with her husband Tom for many years. He had come to Tom's funeral and had stopped by a few times since then to check on her. Pete was a good man, but Margaret had not asked him to find her help. "Pete should have asked me first," Margaret said. She was not angry, but she was confused. "I don't know if I can afford to pay anyone right now." Jake nodded. "Pete told me about that too. He said you might not have much money for wages, but I have a different idea if you're willing to listen." Margaret looked at Jake and then at the little girl. The child was still hiding behind her father, but Margaret could see she was watching everything. There was something sad about the little girl's face. She looked like she had seen too much sadness for someone so young. "What kind of idea?" Margaret asked. "I need a place to stay with my daughter," Jake said. "Somewhere we can settle down for a while? Emma here needs to start school in a real place, not just moving from town to town. And I need steady work, not just the seasonal jobs I've been taking." Jake looked around at Margaret's ranch. He could see the broken fences and the barn door that hung wrong. He could see that the place needed a lot of work. But he could also see that it was good land with good bones. It just needed someone who knew how to fix it. "I can work for room and board," Jake said. "A place for Emma and me to live and food to eat. I can fix everything that's broken and help you run the cattle and horses. I know how to do all the ranch work. I've been doing it my whole life." Margaret thought about this offer. She needed help, that was true, but she also needed to be careful. She did not know this man or his daughter. They could be good people, or they could be trouble. And having strangers live on her ranch would be a big change, but as she looked at the little girl with the stuffed horse, Margaret felt something stir in her heart. The child looked so small and vulnerable, and the man seemed honest. Pete Williams would not have sent someone he did not trust. "Where would you live?" Margaret asked. "There's a small house behind your barn," Jake said. "Pete said it used to be for ranch hands. If it's still good, Emma and I could fix it up and stay there." Margaret remembered the little house. Tom's father had built it years ago for workers. It had been empty for a long time, but it still had a roof and walls. With some work, it could be a home again. The little girl finally looked up at Margaret. She had the biggest, saddest brown eyes Margaret had ever seen. In that moment, Margaret made her decision. "Let me show you the house," she said. Margaret led Jake and Emma through the tall grass toward the small house behind the barn. She had not walked back here in months. The path was overgrown with weeds, and spider webs stretched between the fence posts. Emma stayed close to her father. Still holding her stuffed horse tight, the little house was smaller than Margaret remembered. It had 2 rooms, a kitchen area, and a tiny bathroom. The white paint was old and peeling, but the roof looked solid. Jake walked around the house slowly, checking the walls and windows. He pushed on the door frame and looked up at the roof line. "The bones are good," he said to Margaret. "It needs paint and some fixing, but Emma and I could make it work." Emma finally spoke for the first time. Her voice was very quiet. "Daddy, can I see inside?" Jake opened the front door. It stuck a little, but it opened. The inside smelled dusty and old, but it was clean. There were 2 small bedrooms, one bigger room for sitting and eating, and a kitchen with an old stove and refrigerator. Emma walked through the room, still carrying her horse. "This bedroom could be mine," she said, looking into the smaller room. There was one window that looked out toward Margaret's garden and chicken house. "If Mrs. Thompson says we can stay," Jake reminded. Margaret watched Emma explore the little house. The child seemed to like it, even though it was old and empty. Margaret remembered when Tom's father had built this house. Ranch hands had lived here for years. It had been a happy place once. Maybe it could be happy again. "Tell me about yourselves," Margaret said as they walked back toward the main house. "Where do you come from?" Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he started to talk. "Emma and I have been traveling for about a year now. I take jobs at different ranches, wherever I can find work. Cattle drives, hay cutting, fence building. We move from place to place." "What about Emma's mother?" Margaret asked gently. Jake's face became very sad. "Emma's mother died when Emma was born. It was just one of those things that happen sometimes. The doctors tried everything, but they couldn't save her." Emma had been listening. She came over and took her father's hand. "Mama went to heaven," she said simply, "but she watches over." "Yes?" Margaret felt her heart break a little. This little girl had never known her mother, and Jake had been raising her alone while working hard jobs that kept them moving from place to place. It must be very difficult for both of them. "What about school for Emma?" Margaret asked. That's the hard part, Jake said. She's smart, but moving around so much makes school difficult. I try to teach her what I can, but she needs a real school. With other children. That's why I'm looking for a place where we can stay longer. They reached Margaret's front porch and sat down in the shade. Emma saw Margaret's 3 cats sleeping in the sun and went over to pet them. The cats seemed to like her right away. One of them, an orange cat named Rusty, rubbed against her legs. "Tell me about the work that needs doing here," Jake said. Margaret looked around her ranch and sighed. "I don't even know where to start. The fences are broken in so many places. The cattle are spread out all over and I can't get them where they need to be. The hay should have been cut weeks ago. The barn needs repairs, and I don't know how to do any of it." Jake nodded. He had seen ranches like this before. When the main ranch hand was gone, everything started to fall apart quickly. "How many cattle do you have?" "About 50 head, Margaret said. "My husband Tom always said that was the right number for our land. But they're scattered everywhere now because of the broken fences." "What about horses?" "6 horses. 4 are good riding horses and 2 are older. Tom used them for working cattle." Jake thought about this. 50 cattle and 6 horses on 200 acres was manageable for one person who knew what they were doing. But for a woman who had never done ranch work alone, it would be impossible. "I can round up your cattle and fix your fences," Jake said. "I can cut your hay and repair your barn. I've been doing this kind of work since I was Emma's age." Emma came back over with the orange cat in her arms. "Daddy, this cat likes me. What's his name?" "That's Rusty," Margaret said. "He's been here for 5 years. The other 2 are Bella and Smokey. Can I help take care of them?" Emma asked. Margaret smiled. It was the first real smile she had felt in weeks. "I think they would like that very much." Jake and Margaret talked more about the ranch work. Jake had worked on cattle ranches in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. He knew how to do everything that needed doing. He could ride horses, rope cattle, fix machinery, and build fences. He had learned from his father and grandfather, who had been cowboys all their lives. "Why don't you have your own ranch?" Margaret asked. Jake's face became sad again. "My wife. Sarah and I were saving money to buy land. We had plans and dreams, but when she died, everything changed. I had Emma to take care of, and I couldn't stay in one place long enough to save money. The jobs I could get were short-term work. By the time I paid for food and places to stay, there wasn't much left." Margaret understood. Dreams could disappear very quickly when life changed unexpectedly. Her own dreams of growing old with Tom on their ranch had ended 6 months ago. "What made you decide to come here?" she asked. "Pete Williams told me about you at the livestock auction. He said you were a good woman trying to keep your husband's ranch going. He said you needed help, and I needed a place where Emma could have a real home. Pete thought we might be able to help each other." Margaret looked at Emma, who was now sitting on the porch steps with all 3 cats around her. A little girl was talking to them quietly, telling them about her stuffed horse. She seemed so much happier than when she had first arrived. "Pete was right," Margaret said. "I do need help. And it sounds like you and Emma need a place to call home." Jake looked at her hopefully. "Does that mean you want to try it?" Margaret thought about everything Jake had told her. He seemed like a good man who was trying to take care of his daughter. Emma seemed like a sweet child who needed stability, and Margaret knew she could not keep the ranch going much longer by herself. "Let's try it for a month," she said. "You and Emma can stay. In the little house, I'll provide food and a place to live. You help me with the ranch work. After a month, we can decide if it's working for all of us." Jake smiled for the first time since he had arrived. "That sounds fair. When can we start?" "How about right now?" Margaret said. "You can move your things into the house today. Tomorrow, we can start looking at what needs to be done." Emma heard this and came running over. "Really? We can stay?" "For a month," Margaret said. "We'll see how it goes." Emma hugged her stuffed horse tight. "I like it here already. The cats like me, and there's lots of room to run around." As Jake and Emma went to get their things from the truck, Margaret felt something she had not felt in months: hope Maybe Pete Williams had been right. Maybe she and Jake and Emma could help each other. Maybe this could work, but Margaret had learned that life could change quickly and not always for the better. She would be careful and watch how things went. She hoped Jake was as good and honest as he seemed. She hoped Emma would be happy here. And she hoped that maybe, just maybe, she would not have to face the future alone. The first week with Jake and Emma went better than Margaret had expected. Jake woke up before sunrise every day and started working right away. By the time Margaret made breakfast, he had already checked on the horses and started fixing the most urgent problems around the ranch. On Monday, Jake fixed the barn door that had been hanging crooked for months. He found the right tools in Tom's workshop and had it swinging straight within 2 hours. On Tuesday, he started repairing the broken fence posts. Margaret watched him work from her kitchen window. He moved quickly and knew exactly what he was doing. Emma helped in her own small ways. She collected eggs from the chickens every morning and made sure they had fresh water. She fed the cats and brushed them until their fur was soft and shiny. She also helped Margaret in the garden, pulling weeds and watering the vegetables. Emma is a good helper, Margaret told Jake as they sat on the porch after dinner on Wednesday. Emma was playing with the cats in the yard. She's always been good with animals and growing things, Jake said. Her mother loved gardening. I think Emma gets that from her. Margaret liked having people to cook for again. She had been making small meals just for herself for months. Now she made big dinners with meat and potatoes and vegetables from her garden. Jake and Emma always said thank you and told her how good everything tasted, but by Thursday, some problems started to show up. Jake was very strict with Emma about many things. He made her clean up every toy perfectly before playing with something else. He made her sit up straight at the dinner table and eat everything on her plate. He checked her hands to make sure they were perfectly clean before every meal. Margaret thought Jake was too hard on the little girl. Emma was only 8 years old. Children should be allowed to play and make some messes, but Margaret did not say anything. Jake was Emma's father, and Margaret was just letting them stay at her ranch. The real trouble started on Friday morning. Emma was helping Margaret make breakfast while Jake was outside working on the fence. Emma was excited because she was learning to crack eggs into the pan. Margaret showed her how to tap the egg gently on the edge of the bowl. Like this? Emma asked, holding an egg carefully. Perfect, Margaret said. You're getting very good at this. Emma smiled and reached for another egg. But she was trying to be fast like the grown-ups, and the egg slipped from her hands. It flew across the counter and hit Tom's favorite coffee mug, which was sitting near the stove. The mug fell to the floor and broke into several pieces. Emma's face went white. She stared at the broken mug with tears starting in her eyes. "Oh no," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." Margaret looked at the broken mug. It had been Tom's favorite for 15 years. He had drunk his morning coffee from it every single day. It was dark blue with a picture of a horse on it. Tom had bought it at a rodeo when they were first married. After Tom died, Margaret had kept using the mug because it made her feel close to him, but looking at Emma's scared face, Margaret realized that the mug was just a thing. Emma was more important than any mug, even Tom's favorite one. "It's okay, sweetheart," Margaret said gently. "Accidents happen. It's just a mug." "But it was important to you," Emma said. Tears were running down her cheeks now. "I saw you use it every morning. It was special." Before Margaret could say more, Jake came into the kitchen. He had heard the sound of something breaking and had come to see what happened. He saw the broken mug on the floor and Emma's tears. "What happened here?" he asked in a stern voice. "I broke the mug," Emma said in a tiny voice. "I didn't mean to." Jake's face became very serious. "Emma, how many times have I told you to be careful? You can't just grab things and throw them around." "I wasn't throwing it," Emma said. "It slipped." "That's because you weren't being careful enough," Jake said. "You need to think before you do things." This mug might have been very important to Mrs. Thompson. Margaret started to say that it was okay, but Jake kept talking. "You need to apologize properly," Jake told Emma. "And you need to be more careful from now on." No more helping in the kitchen until you can show me you can be responsible. Emma's tears came harder now. I said I was sorry. I didn't mean to break it. Sorry isn't enough when you break someone else's things, Jake said. You need to learn to be more careful. Margaret wanted to tell Jake that he was being too hard on Emma, but she did not know if she should. Jake was Emma's father. He had the right to decide how to raise his daughter. But Margaret thought Emma was already sorry enough. The little girl was not careless or mean. She was just a child learning new things. Emma ran out of the kitchen and toward the little house where she and Jake were staying. Margaret heard the screen door slam behind her. Jake started to pick up the pieces of the broken mug. I'm really sorry about this, he said to Margaret. Emma is usually more careful than this. I'll talk to her again later. Jake, Margaret said quietly. She's just a little girl. Accidents happen. I know, Jake said, but she needs to learn to be responsible. Life is hard, and she needs to be ready for it. Margaret understood that Jake wanted Emma to be strong and responsible. He was raising her alone, and he wanted her to be able to take care of herself. But Margaret also thought that children needed to feel safe to make mistakes while they were learning. The mug wasn't that important, Margaret said. Emma is more important than any mug. Jake looked at her with surprise. But it was your husband's favorite, wasn't it? I could see how you held it every morning. Margaret realized that Jake had been watching her more carefully than she had thought. He had noticed how she used Tom's mug every day. Yes, it was Tom's favorite, Margaret said. But Tom would not want the little girl to cry over it. He would want Emma to feel welcome here. Jake finished picking up the pieces and put them in the trash. I just want her to learn right from wrong. She already knows right from wrong, Margaret said. She said she was sorry right away. She felt bad about what happened. That shows she has a good heart. Jake was quiet for a moment. Maybe you're right. I worry about her so much. It's just been me and her for so long. I want to make sure she turns out okay. She's going to turn out fine, Margaret said. She's a good child with a good father. After Jake went back outside to work, Margaret went to check on Emma. She found the little girl sitting on the porch of the small house, still crying quietly. Her stuffed horse was in her lap. Emma, Margaret said softly, can I sit with you? Emma nodded but did not look up. Margaret sat down next to her on the porch steps. You know, when I was about your age, I broke my grandmother's favorite teapot. Emma looked up at her with interest. I was trying to help my mother serve tea to some ladies from church, Margaret continued. I picked up the teapot, but it was heavier than I expected. I dropped it right on the kitchen floor. It broke into 100 pieces. What happened? Emma asked. Well, I cried just like you're crying now. I thought my grandmother would be angry with me, but you know what she said? Emma shook her head. She said that teapots can be replaced, but granddaughters cannot be. She said she would rather have me safe and happy than have a perfect teapot. Emma thought about this, but your grandmother's teapot was probably really special. It was, Margaret said. But I was more special to her than any teapot, and you are more special to me than any coffee mug. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Really? Really, Margaret said. And do you know what? I think we can fix that mug. I have some special glue that might work. The mug won't look exactly the same, but it will still hold coffee. Sometimes broken things can be fixed and still be useful. Emma's face brightened a little. Could we try to fix it? We could try, Margaret said, but only if you want to. You don't have to fix it. Breaking it was an accident. I want to try. Emma said, I want to make it better if I can. Margaret stood up and held out her hand to Emma. Then let's go see what we can do. As they walked back to the main house together, Margaret thought about Jake's strictness with Emma. She understood that he was trying to protect his daughter and teach her important lessons. But Margaret also remembered what it was like to be a child. Children needed to feel safe to make mistakes while they learned about the world. Maybe, over time, she could help Jake see that Emma was already a good child who did not need such strict rules. Maybe Jake could learn to relax a little and let Emma be a child. And maybe Emma could learn that not every mistake was a disaster. The broken mug was just the beginning. Margaret sensed that there would be more tests to come as they all learned to live together. After the coffee mug incident, Emma became very quiet and careful around the house. She still did her chores with the chickens and cats, but she moved slowly and checked everything twice before touching it. Margaret noticed that the happy, curious child was becoming afraid to make any mistakes. That evening, Margaret and Emma worked together to fix the broken mug. They sat at the kitchen table with a tube of special glue and the pieces of blue ceramic. Emma was very careful as she held each piece in place while Margaret applied the glue. "See how this piece fits here?" Margaret showed Emma. "It's like putting together a puzzle." Emma nodded and carefully held the next piece. "Will it be as strong as before?" "Maybe not quite as strong," Margaret said honestly. "But it will still work. Sometimes when things are broken and fixed, they're different but still good." As they worked, Emma was very quiet. Finally, she said in a small voice, "I break things a lot. That's why my daddy gets worried." Margaret looked at the little girl's serious face. "What do you mean?" "When I was a baby, I broke my mama," Emma said quietly. "That's why she went to heaven. Daddy says it wasn't my fault, but I know it was because of me." Margaret's heart felt like it was breaking. She put down the glue and turned to face Emma directly. "Emma, sweetheart, listen to me very carefully. You did not break your mama. What happened to her was not your fault. But she died when I was born," Emma said. "If I hadn't been born, she would still be here." Margaret realized that Emma had been carrying this terrible burden for her whole life. No wonder Jake was so protective of her. No wonder Emma was so afraid of making mistakes. "Emma," Margaret said gently, "sometimes sad things happen that are nobody's fault. When your mama died, it was because something went wrong in her body. It had nothing to do with anything you did. You were just a tiny baby. But if I hadn't been there, if you hadn't been there, your daddy would have lost both you and your mama," Margaret said. "Instead, he has you. You are the most important thing in his life. You didn't break anything. You gave your daddy someone to love." Emma thought about this for a long time. She picked up another piece of the mug and carefully placed it where it belonged. "Do you really think so?" she asked. "I know so," Margaret said. "And I think your mama is very proud of the sweet, helpful girl you've become." They finished gluing the mug together. It had thin lines where the cracks were, and it looked different than before, but it was whole again. "It's not perfect," Emma sighed, looking at the repaired mug. "No," Margaret agreed. "But it's still beautiful. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that have been broken and put back together." The next morning, Margaret used the repaired mug for her coffee. Emma watched carefully to see if it would work. When Margaret took her first sip and smiled, Emma clapped her hands together. "It works," Emma said happily. "It works perfectly," Margaret said. "Thank you for helping me fix it." Jake came in for breakfast and saw Margaret using the mug. He looked surprised. "You fixed it?" he asked. "Emma and I fixed it together," Margaret said. "It's different now, but it still works fine." Jake looked at Emma, who was beaming with pride. "That was good of you to help fix what you broke," he told his daughter. "Mrs. Thompson said some things can be fixed even after they're broken," Emma said. "She said sometimes they're still beautiful." Jake sat down at the table for breakfast. Margaret could see he was thinking about something. After Emma went outside to feed the chickens, Jake spoke quietly to Margaret. "She told you about her mother, didn't she?" he said. "She thinks it was her fault," Margaret said gently. "She's been carrying that burden for 8 years. Jake put his head in his hands. "I've tried to tell her it wasn't her fault. But she's so smart. She figured out that her mother died because she was born." "Children sometimes understand the facts but not the meaning," Margaret said. "She knows her mother died when she was born, but she thinks that means she caused it." "I don't know how to help her understand," Jake said sadly. "I've tried explaining it so many times." "Maybe she needs to hear it from someone else," Margaret suggested. "Sometimes children believe things more when they hear them from different people." That afternoon, while Jake was working on repairing the fence around the pasture, Margaret and Emma were working in the garden. They were pulling weeds from around the tomato plants and checking to see which vegetables were ready to pick. Emma found a big red tomato that was perfectly ripe. "Can we pick this one?" she asked. "That's a beautiful tomato," Margaret said. "It's perfect for dinner tonight." As Emma carefully picked the tomato, Margaret said, "You know, Emma, this tomato plant had to go through a lot to grow this tomato." Emma looked interested. "What do you mean?" "Well, first it was just a tiny seed. Then it had to push through the dirt to grow. That was probably hard work. Then it had to grow bigger and stronger. Sometimes the wind blew it around, and sometimes there wasn't enough rain, but it kept growing anyway." Emma nodded, following the story. "Then when it was strong enough, it started to make flowers. And then those flowers became tiny green tomatoes. The plant had to give a lot of its strength to grow these tomatoes. That was hard work too." "But look how good the tomato is," Emma said, holding up the bright red fruit. "Exactly," Margaret said. "The plant worked very hard to make this tomato. It used a lot of its energy and strength. But that wasn't bad or wrong. That's what the plant was supposed to do. Making this tomato was the most important thing the plant could do." Emma thought about this. "Are you talking about my mama?" Margaret nodded. "Your mama's body worked very hard to help you grow, just like this plant worked hard to grow this tomato. Sometimes when someone works very hard to make something beautiful, they get very tired. That's what happened to your mama?" "But she didn't choose to get tired and go to heaven," Emma said. "No, she didn't choose that," Margaret agreed. "But she did choose to help you grow. And I think she would say it was the most important thing she ever did." Emma held the tomato carefully in her small hands. "Do you think she's happy that I'm here?" "I think she's very happy," Margaret said. "I think she watches you take care of the chickens and cats, and she sees how kind you are to everyone. I think she's proud of the wonderful girl you've become." That evening, Jake noticed that Emma seemed more relaxed than she had been in days. She talked and laughed during dinner instead of being very quiet and careful. She even spilled a little milk on the table and didn't start crying when it happened. "It's okay," she said, reaching for a napkin. "Accidents happen sometimes." Jake looked at Margaret with a grateful expression. He could see that something had changed in his daughter. Later, after Emma had gone to bed in the little house, Jake came back to talk to Margaret. They sat on her front porch in the cool evening air. "Thank you," Jake said simply. "I don't know what you said to her today, but she seems lighter somehow." "She just needed to understand that she's a gift, not a problem," Margaret said. "She needed to know that her mother's death wasn't something she caused." Jake was quiet for a moment. "I've been so worried about keeping her safe and teaching her to be careful. I think I made her afraid that everything she does might cause something bad to happen." "You're a good father, Jake," Margaret said. "You've kept her safe and taught her to be kind and helpful. But maybe now she can learn that it's okay to make mistakes sometimes." "I want her to be happy," Jake said. "I want her to feel like a normal child." "She's getting there," Margaret said, "and so are you." As Jake walked back to the little house, Margaret felt that something important had changed between all of them. Emma was beginning to understand that she was loved and wanted, not just protected. Jake was beginning to see that his daughter needed room to grow and make mistakes. And Margaret was beginning to feel like she was part of a family again. The mug with its repaired cracks sat on the kitchen counter, ready for morning coffee. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but it was still useful and still beautiful. Just like people who had been hurt and were learning to heal, it was different but still whole. Margaret went to bed that night feeling more hopeful than she had in a long time. Maybe broken things really could be fixed. Maybe people who had lost important things could find new ways to be happy. Maybe this strange new family they were building together could work after all. Spring arrived early that year, and the ranch began to look better than it had in months. Jake had repaired most of the fences, and the cattle were now contained in the proper pastures. The grass was green and thick, and the horses looked healthy and strong. Margaret's garden was growing well with Emma's help, and even the old barn looked sturdy again after. Jake's repairs. Margaret found herself looking forward to each day in a way she had not felt since Tom died. She woke up knowing that Jake would already be working somewhere on the ranch, fixing things and making them better. She knew that Emma would come to the kitchen for breakfast with stories about the cats or something interesting she had seen outside. Emma had started helping Margaret with cooking, and she was getting very good at it. She could crack eggs without breaking them now, and she knew how to measure flour and sugar for baking. Margaret taught her to make bread and biscuits and pies. Emma was a quick learner and was always eager to try new things. Jake had also been teaching Margaret things about ranch work that Tom had never shown her. He taught her how to read the signs that showed when cattle were healthy or sick. He showed her how to check the horses' feet and how to tell when they needed new shoes. He explained how to know when the grass in each pasture was ready for the cattle to graze. "You're a natural at this," Jake told Margaret one morning as they checked on the new calves together. "You just needed someone to show you how." Margaret felt proud when Jake said things like this. She had always thought ranch work was too hard for her to learn. But with Jake's patient teaching, she was discovering that she could do more than she had believed. The three of them had developed comfortable routines. Jake got up before dawn to check on the animals and start the morning work. Margaret made breakfast for all of them, and Emma helped set the table and feed the cats. After breakfast, Jake and Margaret would work together on ranch tasks while Emma played or helped with smaller jobs. In the evenings, they ate dinner together and talked about their day. Sometimes Jake would tell stories about different ranches where he had worked. Sometimes Margaret would tell stories about the early days when she and Tom were first married. Emma loved these stories and always asked for more, but as the weeks passed, Margaret began to notice something that made her uncomfortable. She was starting to have feelings for Jake that went beyond just being grateful for his help. She noticed how strong and capable he was when he worked with the horses. She noticed how gentle he was with Emma when he thought no one was watching. She noticed how his eyes crinkled when he smiled, which he was doing more often now. These feelings scared Margaret. She felt like she was being disloyal to Tom's memory. Tom had only been gone for 8 months. Was it too soon to have feelings for another man? What would people think if they knew? Jake seemed to be having similar struggles. Margaret caught him looking at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. When their hands accidentally touched while they were working together, he would pull away quickly. Margaret could see that he was fighting feelings too. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Emma asked a question that made both adults very uncomfortable. "Are you going to marry my daddy?" Emma asked Margaret suddenly. Margaret nearly choked on her iced tea. Jake's face turned red and he looked down at his boots. "Emma," Jake said in a warning voice, "that's not something you should ask." "But I was just wondering," Emma said innocently. "Mrs. Thompson is nice and she makes good food and she likes us. And Daddy smiles more now. I thought maybe you might want to be a family." Margaret did not know what to say. Part of her wanted to say yes, that she would love to be a family with Jake and Emma, but another part of her felt guilty for even thinking such things. "Emma," Margaret said gently, "your daddy and I are friends. Good friends who help each other. That's all." Emma looked disappointed. "But wouldn't it be nice if we could all stay together forever?" Jake stood up quickly. "Emma, it's time for you to get ready for bed." After Jake took Emma to the little house, Margaret sat alone on the porch feeling confused. She did want them to stay together forever. She loved having them here. She loved feeling like part of a family again. But she also felt guilty about these feelings. The situation became more complicated the next week when Margaret's brother-in-law, Robert, arrived unexpectedly. Robert was Tom's younger brother, and he had never liked the ranch. He thought Tom and Margaret should have sold it years ago and moved to the city where Robert lived. Robert arrived in a big, expensive car and wearing a suit that looked out of place on a cattle ranch. He hugged Margaret politely, but she could see he was not happy about something. "Margaret, we need to talk," Robert said after greeting her. "Who is that man working on your property, and why is there a child running around here?" Margaret explained about Jake and Emma, but she could see that Robert did not like the situation. So you're letting a complete stranger live on your property? Robert asked. A man you don't know anything about? Margaret, this is not safe. What would Tom think? Tom would think I was smart to get help when I needed it, Margaret said firmly. Jake is a good man, and he's helping me keep the ranch going. Robert looked around at the repaired fences and the healthy-looking cattle. Margaret could see he was surprised by how good everything looked. Well, maybe he's doing good work, Robert admitted. But that's not the point. You don't need to keep this ranch, Margaret. You should sell it and move somewhere safe. Somewhere you don't have to depend on strangers. This is my home, Margaret said. Tom and I built this life together. I'm not going to just give it up. Tom is gone, Robert said bluntly. You can't run a ranch by yourself. Even with this hired man, it's too much for a woman alone. Margaret felt angry. I'm not alone, and I can learn to do whatever needs doing. That evening, Robert met Jake and Emma at dinner. Margaret could see that Robert was studying Jake carefully, looking for something to criticize. Jake was polite but careful around Robert. He answered Robert's questions about his work experience and his plans, but Margaret could tell he was uncomfortable. So you're just planning to stay here indefinitely? Robert asked Jake during dinner. I'm helping Mrs. Thompson with the ranch work, Jake said carefully, as long as she needs my help. And what happens to your daughter's education? She should be in a proper school. Emma, who had been quietly eating her dinner, looked up. I'm going to start school here in the fall. Mrs. Thompson already talked to the school in town. Robert looked surprised. He turned to Margaret. You're planning to enroll her in school? That sounds like you're planning for them to stay permanently. Margaret felt her face get warm. Emma needs to go to school. It's the right thing to do. The right thing to do would be for this man to find a real job and provide for his daughter properly, Robert said. Not to depend on my brother's widow. For charity? Jake's face became very serious. I work for my keep, sir. I'm not taking charity from anyone. Room and board is not the same as a real wage, Robert said. How do you plan to save money for your daughter's future? How do you plan? To buy your own place someday? Margaret could see that Robert's questions were hurting Jake. These were questions Jake had probably asked himself many times. Robert, that's enough, Margaret said firmly. Jake and Emma are welcome here as long as they want to stay. After dinner, Robert asked to speak to Margaret privately. They went into the living room while Jake helped Emma with her reading at the kitchen table. Margaret, I think you're making a mistake, Robert said. This man is obviously taking advantage of your loneliness. You're providing him with a place to live and food to eat, and he's probably planning to stay here forever. Jake works very hard, Margaret said. He's earned everything I've given him. But what's his real plan? Robert asked. Is he planning to marry you and take over Tom's ranch? Margaret felt her face turn red. That's a terrible thing to say. Is it? You're a widow with a good ranch and no children? He's a man with no property and a child to support. From his perspective, marrying you would solve all his problems. Jake is not like that, Margaret said angrily. He's a good man who's trying to take care of his daughter. Maybe he is a good man, Robert said. But that doesn't mean he's not also being practical. Think about it, Margaret. How convenient for him that you need help and he needs a place to stay. How convenient that his daughter needs a mother figure and you need a family. Margaret wanted to argue, but Robert's words planted seeds of doubt in her mind. Was Jake only being kind to her because he needed a place to stay? Were her feelings for him real, or was she just lonely and grateful for help? I think you should sell the ranch, Robert continued. You could move to the city near me. You'd be safe, and you wouldn't have to worry about strangers taking advantage of you. I'm not selling the ranch, Margaret said firmly. This is my home. Then at least be careful, Robert said. Don't let yourself get too attached to people who might not have your best interests at heart. That night, Margaret lay in bed thinking about Robert's words. She looked out her window toward the little house where Jake and Emma were sleeping. Were her feelings for Jake real? Were his feelings for her real? Or were they both just lonely people who had found comfort in each other? Robert stayed for 3 more days, and Margaret could see that his presence was making everyone uncomfortable. Jake became very formal and distant. He spoke only when spoken to and avoided being in the same room with Robert whenever possible. Emma stopped her cheerful chatter at meals and stayed close to Margaret when Robert was around. Margaret tried to defend Jake and Emma, but Robert kept asking pointed questions about their future plans. He made it clear that he thought Margaret was being foolish to trust strangers. By the time Robert left on Thursday morning, Margaret felt confused and worried about everything. "Think about what I said," Robert told Margaret as he put his suitcase in his expensive car. "You don't have to live this way. There are better options for you." After Robert drove away, Margaret noticed that Jake was more distant than before. He still did his work around the ranch, but he didn't talk and laugh with her like he had been doing. Emma seemed sad and kept asking if they had done something wrong. "Did that man not like us?" Emma asked Margaret while they were feeding the chickens together. "Robert is just worried about me," Margaret said, trying to explain without hurting Emma's feelings. "Sometimes adults worry about things that don't need worrying about." "But he didn't seem to like Daddy," Emma said. "He asked a lot of mean questions," Margaret sighed. "Robert thinks I should live differently than I do. He doesn't understand that your daddy and I are helping each other." Friday evening brought dark clouds and the smell of rain in the air. Jake checked the weather radio and found that a severe storm was coming through during the night. The weather service was warning about high winds and possible tornadoes. "We should move the horses into the barn," Jake told Margaret, "and make sure everything is tied down tight." They worked together to bring the 6 horses in from the pasture. The horses seemed nervous and restless, sensing the approaching storm. Jake and Margaret checked all the barn doors and windows to make sure they were secure. "What about the cattle?" Margaret asked, looking out at the 50 heads scattered across the main pasture. "They'll find shelter where they can," Jake said. "Cattle are good at taking care of themselves in storms. But we should check on them as soon as the storm passes." Emma helped them carry extra feed and water into the barn for the horses. She also helped Margaret bring the cats inside the house. The 3 barn cats were not used to being indoors, but the approaching storm made them willing to hide under Margaret's furniture. By 8 o'clock, the wind was getting stronger and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. Jake made sure that Emma was safe in the little house with extra flashlights and a battery radio. Then he came back to check on Margaret. "You should stay in the strongest part of your house tonight," Jake told her, "away from windows. If the storm gets really bad, go to your basement." Margaret nodded, but she was worried about Jake and Emma in the smaller house. "Maybe you and Emma should stay here in the main house tonight. It's bigger and stronger." Jake hesitated. Margaret could see he was thinking about Robert's visit and the questions about their relationship. "We'll be fine in our house," he said. "Finally. But if things get bad, we'll come over." The storm hit around midnight. Margaret woke up to the sound of wind howling around the house and rain pounding on the roof. She could hear things blowing around outside, probably trash cans, and loose boards. The power went out, leaving her in complete darkness. Margaret found her flashlight and went to look out the window. She could barely see anything through the rain, but she could tell that the storm was very bad. Tree branches were flying through the air, and she could hear the sound of metal banging against something. Around 2 in the morning, Margaret heard a loud crashing sound that was different from the other storm noises. It sounded like something big had fallen or broken. She tried to see out the window, but the rain was too heavy. Then she heard someone pounding on her front door. She grabbed her flashlight and robe and ran to answer it. Jake stood on her porch, soaked with rain and looking worried. "The barn!" Jake shouted over the wind. "Part of the roof came down. Some of the horses might be trapped." Margaret's heart jumped with fear. "Are they hurt?" "I don't know yet. I need help moving some of the fallen beams." "And Emma is scared? Can she stay here while we work?" Margaret could see Emma behind Jake, holding her stuffed horse and looking frightened. "Of course, Emma, come inside." Margaret quickly got Emma settled in the living room with blankets and her flashlight. Then she put on her raincoat and boots and followed. Jake out into the storm. The wind was so strong that Margaret could barely walk straight. Jake held her arm to help her stay on her feet as they made their way to the barn. When they got there, Margaret could see the damage. A large oak tree had fallen across one corner of the barn, crushing part of the roof and trapping two of the horses in their stalls. "We have to get them out," Jake shouted over the storm. "If more of the roof falls, they could be crushed." Jake had already started moving the smaller pieces of debris. Margaret joined him, pulling away broken boards and chunks of roofing material. Her hands got cut and scraped, but she kept working. The two trapped horses were whinnying with fear, and Margaret could see that one of them was bleeding from a cut on its shoulder. Working together in the dark and rain, Margaret and Jake managed to clear enough debris to open the stall doors. Jake went in first to calm the horses and lead them out. The injured horse was limping, but both animals were able to walk to safety in another part of the barn, but their work was not finished. As they were checking on the other horses, they heard a different sound, the frightened lowing of cattle. Looking out into the storm, Margaret could see dark shapes moving in the wrong direction. The cattle had broken through a fence and were scattering across the property. "If they get out onto the main road, they could cause accidents," Jake said. "We have to try to round them up." Margaret had never worked cattle in good weather, much less in a storm at night. But she knew Jake was right. Loose cattle on the road could hurt people or be killed by cars. Jake ran to get two of the horses that were not injured. Margaret had only ridden horses a few times since Tom died, but she climbed onto the saddle Jake brought her. Together they rode out into the storm to find the scattered cattle. It was the hardest thing Margaret had ever done. The rain made it almost impossible to see. The wind made it hard to stay on the horse. The cattle were frightened and difficult to control. But Jake knew what he was doing, and he shouted instructions to Margaret over the storm. "Circle around behind those 3 cows," Jake called. "Push them back toward the others." Margaret did her best to follow Jake's directions. Her horse seemed to understand the work better than she did, moving in the right directions almost without being guided. Slowly, working together, they managed to gather most of the cattle and drive them into a pasture that still had good fences. By the time they finished, it was almost dawn and the storm was finally moving away. Margaret and Jake rode back to the barn, both of them exhausted and soaked through. Margaret had never been so tired in her life, but she also felt proud. She had helped save the horses and cattle. She had done real ranch work in the worst possible conditions. As they took care of the horses and checked all the animals one more time, Margaret realized something important. During the whole long night of crisis, Robert had never crossed her mind. She had not thought about his warnings or his doubts about Jake. She had only thought about working together to save the animals and protect the ranch. Jake seemed to realize the same thing. As they walked back toward the house in the early morning light, he looked at Margaret with respect and gratitude. "I couldn't have done that without you," he said. "You were amazing out there." Margaret felt warm despite her wet clothes. "We make a good team," she said. "Yes," Jake said, looking into her eyes. "We do." When they got back to the house, they found Emma asleep on the living room couch, still holding her stuffed horse. She woke up when they came in and ran to hug both of them. "I was so scared," Emma said, "but I knew you would take care of everything." As Margaret made coffee and breakfast for all of them, she thought about the night they had just been through. She and Jake had worked together as true partners, trusting each other completely. Emma had been brave and patient during the scary storm. They had faced a real crisis together and come through it as a family. Margaret realized that what Robert had said about Jake taking advantage of her was wrong. A man who would risk his safety to save her horses and cattle in a dangerous storm was not someone who was just using her. A man who worked beside her all night without complaint was someone she could trust completely, and she also realized that her feelings for Jake were not just loneliness or gratitude. They were real feelings based on respect and partnership and genuine caring. She loved Jake not because she needed him, but because of who he was. The storm had damaged the barn and scattered the cattle, but it had also cleared away Margaret's doubts. She knew now that she wanted Jake and Emma to stay not just for a month or a season, but forever. The weeks after the storm were busy with repairs and rebuilding. Jake worked from sunrise to sunset, fixing the damaged barn roof and replacing the broken fences. Margaret helped him with everything, and she was amazed at how much she had learned about ranch work. Emma helped too, bringing tools and holding boards while the adults worked. The injured horse healed well under Jake's careful treatment. The cattle settled back into their normal routines once the fences were repaired. The ranch began to look even better than it had before the storm, because Jake took the opportunity to improve things while he was rebuilding them. But as summer progressed, Margaret noticed that Jake was becoming restless. He spent evenings sitting on the porch of the little house, looking out toward the road with a thoughtful expression. Sometimes she caught him reading newspapers from other towns, looking at job advertisements. Emma seemed to sense her father's mood and became more clingy and quiet. One evening in late July, Jake came to talk to Margaret after Emma had gone to bed. They sat on Margaret's front porch in the warm summer air, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of cattle settling down for the night. "Margaret," Jake said carefully, "I've been thinking about our arrangement here." Margaret's heart began to beat faster. She had been dreading this conversation, but she knew it was coming. "What about it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Well, the ranch is in good shape now. The fences are all repaired and stronger than before. The barn is better than it was. You've learned a lot about managing the cattle and horses. Maybe you don't need my help anymore." Margaret looked at him in surprise. "Is that what you think? That I don't need your help?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "I think you're stronger and more capable than you know. You proved that during the storm. You could probably run this ranch by yourself now if you had to." "But I don't want to run it by myself," Margaret said. "I like having you and Emma here. I like working together." Jake stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. "That's just it, Margaret. I'm not sure this is fair to you. You're taking care of Emma and me, giving us a home and food and stability, but what are we really giving you in return?" "You're giving me everything," Margaret said quietly. "You saved my ranch. You taught me how to be a real rancher. You and Emma made me feel like I have a family again." "But is that enough?" Jake asked. "You could hire ranch hands to do the work. You don't need to take care of someone else's child. You could have your own life, maybe find someone to marry who could be a real partner." Margaret stood up and walked over to him. "Jake, what's this really about? Are you unhappy here?" Jake turned to face her. In the moonlight, she could see that his face was full of pain and confusion. "I'm happier here than I've been anywhere since Sarah died," he said. "Emma is happier too. She loves you and she loves this place. But I keep thinking about what your brother-in-law said, about how I'm taking advantage of your kindness." "Robert doesn't understand our situation," Margaret said firmly. "He doesn't understand what we have here." "But maybe he's right about some things," Jake said. "I don't have any money saved. I can't offer you security or a real future. Emma and I are basically living on your charity." "It's not charity when people care about each other," Margaret said. "It's not charity when people work together and help each other." Jake looked away. "I've been getting letters from a ranch owner in Montana. He's offering me a job as a cattle foreman. Good wages, a house for Emma and me, and steady work. Emma could go to school there." Margaret felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. "You're thinking about leaving." "I'm thinking about what's best for everyone," Jake said. "Emma needs stability, but she also needs to see that her father can provide for her properly. And you need to think about your own future." "My future is here," Margaret said. "With you and Emma?" Jake looked at her with surprise. "Margaret, you can't plan your whole life around us." "We're not really your family." Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. "You feel like my family. Emma feels like the daughter I never had. You feel like, She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Like what?" Jake asked gently. Margaret took a deep breath. She knew she was about to say something that would change everything between them. But she couldn't keep the truth inside anymore. You feel like the man I want to spend the rest of my life with, she said quietly. Jake stared at her in the moonlight. Margaret, ... I know it's too soon, she said quickly. I know Tom has only been gone for 10 months. I know people will think I'm being foolish, but I can't help how I feel. I feel the same way, Jake said so quietly she almost didn't hear him. Margaret looked up at him in surprise. You do? I love you, Jake said. I've been fighting it for weeks, but I love you. And I love the life we've built here together, but I also feel guilty about it. Guilty about what? About moving on from Sarah, about letting Emma get attached to another woman who might leave her life, about taking advantage of your loneliness. Margaret reached out and took his hands. Jake, loving someone new doesn't mean you love Sarah any less. And you're not taking advantage of me. I'm a grown woman who can make her own choices. But what about your husband? Jake asked. Don't you feel guilty about having feelings for another man? Margaret thought about Tom and all the years they had shared together. Tom loved me, she said finally. He would want me to be happy. He would want Emma to have a mother's love. He would want this ranch to be a home for a family. Jake pulled his hands away and walked back to the porch railing. Even if all that's true, I still don't have anything to offer you. No money, no property, no security. You have yourself, Margaret said. You have your knowledge and your strength. And your kindness. You have Emma. That's everything I want. But what happens when you realize you could do better? Jake asked. What happens when you meet someone who can give you more than a life of hard work and struggle? Margaret walked over to him and turned him to face her. Jake Morrison, I have never met a better man than you. I don't want someone who can give me more. I want someone who will work beside me and love me and help me raise Emma. I want you. Jake looked into her eyes for a long moment. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. It was the first time either of them had been honest about their feelings, and Margaret felt like her heart might burst with happiness. When they finally pulled apart, Jake rested his forehead against hers. I love you so much, he whispered. I love you and I want to stay here forever. But I'm scared, Margaret. I'm scared of making promises I can't keep. I'm scared of hurting you or Emma. I'm scared too, Margaret admitted. But I'm more scared of letting you walk away because we're both too afraid to take a chance on happiness. They stood together. In the moonlight, holding each other and thinking about the future, Margaret knew that loving Jake meant taking risks. It meant facing the disapproval of people like Robert. It meant blending their lives together in ways that might be complicated and difficult, but it also meant having a real family again. It meant sharing the joys and struggles of ranch life with someone who understood it. It meant giving Emma the stable, loving home she deserved. It meant not being alone anymore, the job in Montana, Margaret said finally. When you have to give them an answer? Next week, Jake said. What are you going to tell them? Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, and Margaret could see that he had made his decision. I'm going to tell them I already have a job, he said, with the best boss in the world. Margaret laughed and kissed him again. She knew there would be challenges ahead. People would talk and gossip about their relationship. There would be legal questions about the ranch and financial decisions to make. Emma would need time to adjust to thinking of Margaret as a stepmother instead of just a friend. But for the first time since Tom died, Margaret felt like the future was full of possibilities instead of just problems. She had found love again when she thought it was impossible. Emma would have a complete family. The ranch would continue to be a working, thriving place. As they said goodnight and Jake walked back to the little house, Margaret looked up at the stars and thought about how much her life had changed. A few months ago, she had been a lonely widow struggling to keep her ranch going. Now she was a woman in love, planning a future with a good man and his daughter. Sometimes the best things in life came when you least expected them, sometimes broken. Hearts could heal and love could grow in the most unlikely places. Sometimes taking a chance on a stranger could lead to finding everything you didn't even know you were looking for. August came with hot days and warm nights, and the ranch was busier than it had been in years. Margaret and Jake worked together every day, and their love for each other grew stronger as they shared the daily tasks of caring for the land and animals. Emma started calling Margaret Mama Margaret, which made Margaret's heart sing with joy every time she heard it, but Margaret knew that before she and Jake could truly move forward together, she needed to face some important truths about her. Past 1 year ago, she had been Tom's wife, completely devoted to their life together. Now she was in love with another man and planning a different future. She needed to make peace with that change. On a quiet morning in late August, Margaret decided to visit Tom's grave. She had not been there since the funeral, partly because it was too painful and partly because she felt guilty about her new happiness. But she knew it was time to say a proper goodbye. Tom was buried in the small cemetery just outside of town, under a big oak tree that provided shade on hot days like this one. Margaret brought fresh flowers from her garden, the same kind of flowers she used to grow for Tom when he was alive. She sat down on the grass next to the headstone and talked to Tom as if he were sitting beside her. "I miss you," she said simply. "I miss our talks and our plans and the way you made me laugh. I miss having coffee with you in the mornings and working in the garden together." The morning was quiet except for the sound of birds in the oak tree and the distant noise of traffic on the main road. "But I have something to tell you," Margaret continued. "I've fallen in love again. His name is Jake, and he has a little girl named Emma. They're living on our ranch now, and Jake is taking care of it the way you used to." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude and relief. "I know you would like Jake," she said. "He's a good man who works hard and loves his daughter the way you would have loved our children, if we had been blessed with them. And Emma is the sweetest child. She calls me Mama Margaret, and it feels right." Margaret arranged the flowers in the small vase next to the headstone. "I hope you understand," she said. "I hope you know that loving Jake doesn't mean I loved you any less. It just means that my heart is big enough for both of you." A gentle breeze moved through the oak tree, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like an answer. Margaret felt a sense of peace that she had not felt since Tom died. She knew, somehow, that Tom approved of her choice to love again. When Margaret got back to the ranch, she found Jake sitting on her front porch steps, looking worried. Emma was playing with the cats in the yard, but she kept glancing at her father with concern. "Is everything all right?" Margaret asked, sitting down beside Jake. "I was wondering where you went," Jake said. "You were gone for a long time." "I went to visit Tom's grave," Margaret said. "I needed to talk to him about us." Jake looked surprised. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that I love you and Emma, and that I want us to be a family," Margaret said. "I told him that I think he would approve." Jake took her hand. "How do you feel about it?" "I feel ready," Margaret said. "Ready to move forward with you." Emma came running over when she heard them talking. "Daddy, are you and Mama Margaret getting married?" Margaret and Jake looked at each other and laughed. Emma always seemed to know what the adults were thinking before they said it out loud. "We've been talking about it," Jake said carefully. "How would you feel about that?" Emma clapped her hands together with excitement. "I would love it. Then we could stay here forever, and Mama Margaret would really be my mama." Margaret felt her heart overflow with love for this child who had brought so much joy into her life. "There's something else we need to talk about," Jake said to both Emma and Margaret. "I got another letter from that ranch in Montana. The owner wants an answer about the job." Emma's face fell. "You're not going to take it, are you, Daddy?" "No, sweetheart," Jake said. "I'm going to stay right here, but I want to do things properly." Jake stood up and walked in front of Margaret. Then, to her complete surprise, he got down on one knee. "Margaret Thompson," he said, "will you marry me? Will you let me be your husband and let Emma be your daughter? Will you let us share your life and your ranch and make a real family together?" Margaret felt tears of happiness running down her face. "Yes," she said, "yes, to everything." Emma squealed with delight and threw her arms around both of them. The three cats came running over to see what all the excitement was about, and soon they were all laughing and hugging in a happy pile on the porch steps. That evening they made plans for their wedding. They decided to have a simple ceremony. In the fall, after the harvest was finished and before the cold weather came, Emma wanted to be the flower girl, and she immediately started planning what dress she would wear and what flowers she would carry. "Can we have the wedding right here on the ranch?" Emma asked. "In the barn where Daddy fixed the roof?" Margaret thought that was a perfect idea. The barn where they had worked together during the storm would be a meaningful place to start their new life as a family. They invited Pete Williams, who had brought them together in the first place. They invited Margaret's few close friends from church and the neighbors who had become like family over the years. Jake had no family left, but he invited some of the ranch hands he had worked with over the years who had become good friends. Margaret wrote a letter to Robert telling him about her engagement. She knew he would not approve, but she wanted him to hear the news from her instead of from someone else. Robert wrote back a short, cold letter saying that she was making a mistake, but Margaret was not surprised. She hoped that someday he would understand, but she was not going to let his disapproval stop her from being happy. The weeks before the wedding were some of the happiest of Margaret's life. She and Emma went shopping for wedding dresses together. Emma helped her pick out flowers for the ceremony. Jake worked extra hard to make sure the ranch looked perfect for their special day. Margaret also started the legal process of adopting Emma. Jake wanted Emma to be officially Margaret's daughter, not just in their hearts but in the law as well. Emma was so excited about this that she could barely contain herself. "I'm going to have a real mama," she told the cats one morning while feeding them. "And she's going to be my mama forever and ever." The adoption papers would take several months to complete, but Margaret and Jake wanted to start the process right away. Margaret had never thought she would be a mother, and now she was going to have a daughter who needed her and loved her. As the wedding day approached, Margaret sometimes felt nervous about all the changes that were coming. She was giving up her independence to share her life with Jake and Emma. She was taking on the responsibility of being a mother. She was promising to love and care for people who might need more from her than she knew how to give, but mostly she felt excited and grateful. She was getting a second chance at love and family. She was gaining a partner who understood ranch life and could help her make the land productive and profitable. She was gaining a daughter who brought laughter and joy into every day. The wedding took place on a beautiful October morning when the leaves were golden and red and the air was crisp and clean. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Jake wore his best suit and the cowboy hat that he had been wearing the day they first met. Emma wore a pink dress and carried a bouquet of wildflowers from Margaret's garden. Pete Williams walked Margaret down the aisle, which was actually just the path from the house to the barn. The barn had been decorated with hay bales for seating and autumn flowers everywhere. It looked beautiful and rustic and exactly right for their family. The pastor from Margaret's church performed the ceremony. He had known Margaret for many years and had watched her struggle through the grief of losing Tom. He was genuinely happy to see her finding love and hope again. When Jake and Margaret exchanged vows, they promised to love and support each other through all the challenges of ranch life. They promised to work together as partners in everything they did. They promised to give Emma a stable, loving home where she could grow up feeling safe and cherished. Emma stood beside them during the ceremony, holding both of their hands. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Emma cheered louder than anyone else in the barn. The reception was a simple party with food that Margaret and her friends had cooked together. There was dancing to music played by a local band that included 2 fiddles and a guitar. Emma danced with every man at the party and felt very grown-up and important. As the sun was setting and the guests were starting to go home, Margaret and Jake walked out to the pasture where the cattle were grazing peacefully. Emma skipped ahead of them, chasing fireflies that were beginning to blink in the gathering darkness. "Are you happy?" Jake asked, putting his arm around Margaret's shoulders. "I'm happier than I ever thought I could be again," Margaret said. "Are you?" "I feel like the luckiest man in the world," Jake said. "I have a wife I love, a daughter who's thriving, and a home where we can build a good life together." They watched Emma running through the grass, completely carefree and joyful. In the distance, they could see the lights of their house, their home, glowing warmly in the dusk.